Thank you very much for coming. We have quorum. Let us invite the government officials into the room first. Members, today, this is the 11th of the meeting of this subcommittee on long-term housing strategy. Agenda item number 1, information papers issued since the last meeting. In fact, the following paper has been issued. CB1 829/1314/01. Referral arising from the meeting between Legislative Council members and Wong District Council members on the 5th of December 2013 regarding the relaunch of the TPS and review on the survey on household income of public rental housing tenants. Agenda item number 2, long-term housing strategy report on public consultation. There are several papers under this. First one, CB1 1053/1314/01, Administration's paper on long-term housing strategy report on public consultation. Second, CB1 915/1314/01, long-term housing strategy report on public consultation published by the Long-Term Housing Strategy Steering Committee. The relevant paper is CB1 1756/1213/01. Consultation document entitled Long-Term Housing Strategy Building Consensus, Building Homes, issued by the Long-Term Housing Strategy Steering Committee. May I welcome the government officials for attending our meeting, and they are Professor Anthony Chang, Secretary for Transport and Housing, Mr. Prescott, Permanent Secretary for Transport and Housing, Ms. Agnes Wong, Deputy Secretary for Transport and Housing, and Ms. Alfred Lee, SAO, Housing Department. If I may now call upon the Policy Secretary to take us through the paper. Professor Chang, please. Mr. Chairman, the Steering Committee from the 3rd of September to 2nd of December last year consulted members of the public on Hong Kong's long-term housing strategy. Within the 3-month consultation period, the Steering Committee and the THB team attended over 50 meetings in fora, including covering the 6 open fora organized by the Steering Committee for general public, concerned groups, and other stakeholders. We also attended the public hearing of this subcommittee. We received about 800 written submissions. The Steering Committee on the 17th February 2014 submitted a report on the consultation to the government, and that is this one. The report consolidated the views received during the consultation period and made its final view concerning various issues. The report has been sent to members, and I will now highlight the major issues. Now, the report covers the following area. The public generally concurred with the Steering Committee's analysis and assessment, and that should be supply-led and with public housing accounting for a high proportion of new housing production. There is general support for long-term housing supply target at 470,000 units for the coming 10 years, and the public generally agreed that in terms of new housing, about 60% of public housing. As mentioned in the report, a high number of respondents, including members of public, support the 470,000 unit as the target for coming 10 years. Although some are concerned that the Steering Committee has underestimated long-term housing demand in terms of actual number, the proposal of 470,000 units in the coming 10 years are based on objective and strict calculations on the number of new households and other categories of demand. It is not an underestimate nor an overestimate. The steering committee has also proposed to revise the overall demand in order to reflect the latest socio-economic situation and market situation. During the public consultation period, the steering committee, together with the Bureau's team, have met with various groups and also explained through various articles the calculation method for the housing targets, and the paper has been given to members last year. During the public consultation period, some held the view that the recommendations by the steering committee may force the administration to scramble for land. We don't agree with this scramble for land allegation. There is a keen demand for housing in the community. In order to achieve the targets, it is a tall order and important challenge. The administration will seek the support of the community to get the land resources to meet the coming 10-year housing needs. With regard to the new supply, the 60%, 40% ratio between public housing and private housing, this is in response to the demand for the community. There is a shortage of supply. There are rising prices. The administration has to take the lead to enhance the supply of public housing to turn around the imbalanced situation. We also need to maintain stability of the private sector. We cannot one-sidedly suppress the supply of private housing. We think the 60 to 40% is a reasonable proportion, and the administration also agrees with that. Apart from the long-term housing targets, there are a series of issues which the community have come to a consensus, and we are in paragraphs. We list them in paragraph 3. I do not repeat them. I just want to point out that the steering committee has made proposals on making full use of public housing resources, and that is in line with the recommendations of Report 61 of the Commissioner of Audit. The direction is generally supported by the community. The recommendations have been given to the Housing Authority for following up. After the issue of the report, there are views which said that the steering committee has not come up with specific measures in dealing with SDUs or subdivided units. But in fact, in the consultation period in September, issued in September last year with regard to SDUs, the steering committee has formed a view. Safety is a priority and should not be neglected, and members of the public also recognize this. The administration will introduce measures to prohibit subdivided units in industrial buildings. As for subdivided units in domestic blocks, the administration will deal with fire safety issues and step up law enforcement. As for the introduction of a licensing or landlord registration system of subdivided units, there are objections to that. They are of the view that if there are no ancillary measures such as providing transitional housing or rent protection, then there will be a reduction in SDU, thereby checking up rent. Some are concerned that the landlords will pass on the cost of compliance to the tenants. Some landlords also concerned that licensing or registration system may encourage the development of more SDUs in private buildings, causing structural problems, building management problems, or fire safety problems. And therefore, it's necessary to put an end to SDUs. The steering committee recognizes that the licensing or registration system is controversial. The administration should proceed cautiously and balance the pros and cons. The administration will carefully look into the feasibility of the proposals before forming a view. The public consultation has reflected that there are calls from different quarters for rent control in order to assist the SDU tenants. The steering committee recognizes that those who propose for rent control of the view are concerned about high rent, which is a burden on the low-income earners. But the steering committee is also concerned about the impact of rent control, which will lead to a reduction in supply and increase in rent. The administration has to consider the matter very carefully before, and it has to obtain a clear consensus before taking any form of decision. The community is divided on rent control. In response to members' concern, we will give a detailed analysis and analyze the pros and cons and long-term impacts of rent control. Some ask the administration to use public funds to provide rental support or rental assistance. But we are concerned that when demand is tight, any type of rent assistance will have a contrary effect. This will only lead to rent increase and thereby offsetting part or even whole of the benefit from rent subsidy. That may become passing on of interest to the landlords. We need to give some time to increase production to solve the problem. We will consider various ways to adopt a multi-pronged approach to deal with those who are suffering from inadequate housing. Mr. Chairman, the consultation provides a good opportunity to focus public views on issues that are related to our housing development. We are glad to see that the community is able to reach consensus in certain areas, and they have formed a firm foundation for our long-term housing strategy. I'd like to thank members of the steering committee for their hard work in the past 18 months. The steering committee, having submitted a report to the administration, has completed its work. The ball is now in the court of the administration. Will carefully study the consultation report and the views collected to formulate our long-term housing strategy. We hope to announce our policy by the end of this year. At the same time, we'll follow up the various recommendations and formulate suitable policies and measures. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Professor Cheung, for your detailed report.
Members, the floor is now open for questions and comments. Mr. Kwok Kim, Alice Mack, Kwok Wai Kong, Frederick Fong, Lee Chok Yan, Leung Chi Chung have signified their wish to speak. Any more? I'd like to know how many members would like to speak. If we have very few members, accord each member more time. Dr. Lo Wai Kwok as well, and also Mr. Leung Yu Chung. Members, today, this is the 11th meeting of the Subcommittee on the Long-Term Housing Strategy under the Panel on Housing. For this meeting, it is actually the first meeting after the completion of work by the LTHS Steering Committee. At the House Committee meeting, when we discussed a possible extension of the scrutiny period of this subcommittee, I already requested that our scrutiny period be extended. Now that the consultation report has been published and we've already got conclusive comments, and as you heard from the Bureau Director just now, the government will start to examine the recommendations of the LTHS Steering Committee. And then in December this year, in terms of policies, the government will announce what approaches will be adopted for the LTHS. Therefore, the work of this subcommittee should comment or ask questions on this consultation report. Apparently, the work of this subcommittee can come to a close, at least temporarily. Is that the case? In a moment, I'd like to have your comments. That is, apart from making comments and asking questions about this consultation report, members can in a moment tell me whether or not the work of this subcommittee should come to an end. As regards to other concerns like rental control, the over-provided households, etc., we can discuss them in the panel on housing. In fact, the panel on housing has already set a timetable for a whole series of issues to be discussed and papers to be submitted by the government. Before this meeting, Leung Yiu-chung, Albert Chan, and Gary Fan wrote a letter to me asking me to handle the over-provided households. I understand that the housing panel has already set a timetable for discussing that issue. So in a moment when members speak, I'd like to have their views on whether or not the subcommittee should end its work after this meeting. So I follow the order of registration. Mr. Ip, today I'll accord 5 minutes to each member, including questions and answers. So there's ample time for you to ask questions. Mr. Ip got him. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to go to your first question. The terms of reference of this subcommittee is to discuss the long-term housing strategy. So I think this meeting is a suitable time for us to stop for a while. In fact, for the public consultation on LTHS, the DAB has already submitted its views to the Bureau. I believe the Bureau has already received our views. We support the supply-led principle, but there's a worry. In the private sector, how can you mobilize the private sector to have a satisfactory housing production? As regards the target of 470,000 flats in 10 years, in the ratio of 6:4 between the public sector and the private sector, we've also expressed our support. Well, there are so many issues involved in this exercise. I'm afraid that I'll very soon exhaust my time, so I'll focus on HOS. It started in 1978 and stopped in 2003. Altogether, in those 25 years, we built 320,000 units. That is 13,000 units per year. The proposed 5,000 units per year now is, to me, not sufficient. The income limit will be adjusted to $40,000. So 70,000 households will become eligible. Therefore, the number 5,000 is very inadequate. As for the significance of the HOS, it's not just for the low and medium income households for home ownership. I think most importantly, it is playing a mobilization role or a mobility role. That is, PRH tenants will be encouraged to purchase HOS flats such that those on the waiting list can get PRH units. So we should work more on the attractiveness of the HOS, particularly to the green form applicants. For example, you can allow 2 members of each household to benefit. As for the PRH tenants, the green form applicants, very often they're now in the urban areas. So if you can build more HOS flats, it will be more attractive to them. So I think you should enhance your effort in HOS production. Moreover, you should consider the present threshold of about 70% of the market price. Can you reduce it to 50%? Then it will be more attractive to the green form applicants. Can you consider such approaches? Bureau Director, let me refer to the figures first. In this year's policy address, the CE said that he had actually accepted the overall target of 470,000 units in 10 years and the ratio of 6:4 between the public and private sectors. So altogether, 80,000 out of 280,000 will be HOS flats, averaging 8,000 per year. As I explained in the panel on housing, we won't be able to effect huge increases on those figures, and the production will focus on the second 5-year period. So 80,000 will be HOS, 200,000 will be PRH. Mr. Ip asked how we can offer more opportunities to the PRH tenants so that they can purchase HOS flats and vacate their PRH units to those on the waiting list. Well, that's actually our objective, and the LTHS Steering Committee also subscribed to that target. Well, at the end of this year, when we announce our strategy, final strategy, we'll tell you our final decision. As for pricing, we must look at the affordability of our target purchases. Historically, it's 70%, but sometimes it's not 70%. It did go down to 60% at one time. Those issues raised by Mr. Ip will be discussed in the panel on housing, and we'll have specific discussions about the HOS production targets. Ms. Alice Mack, may I first comment on paragraph 6.29 to 6.31 of the report, which concern the human resources of the construction industry. I don't know why these days all government documents have to mention human resources. Anyway, Bureau Director, I hope that in developing PRH units, you'll be able to honor what you say in paragraph 6.30. That is, local employment should not be affected. Local employees should not be affected. Don't tell us that you have to import labor because we are to build more PRH units. That's what you say in your paper. And then I'd like to turn to redevelopment. The document says that there's general support for the redevelopment of the more aged PRH estates. Yes, we did hear from the PRH tenants of older estates that they would like to have their living environment improved. But you have to understand that in these older estates, there are elderly tenants. Will they be affected by redevelopment? And then after this report, the government also announced 22 PRH estates with redevelopment potentials, but no more details were announced. As a result, the incumbent tenants in these estates, those who would like to have redevelopment, would like to see a more expeditious program. But those who do not want to have their estates redeveloped are very worried. So when will you announce the redevelopment timetable for these PRH estates so that the tenants will be mentally better prepared? And what about the rehousing subsidy? At the moment, the rates have not been adjusted. So when you redevelop a PRH estate, you should try to minimize the impact on the incumbent tenants. And for rehousing, when you redevelop an estate, you should build an estate with more units. But then the impact on the incumbent tenant should be minimized. Bureau Director, indeed, recently the Housing Department assessed the redevelopment potentials of 22 estates to address the aspirations of tenants. I have to say that that does not mean that these 22 estates will be immediately redeveloped, even though they have redevelopment potentials. And then we have to consider whether the redevelopment will result in increased number of flats. And Ms. Mack also asked whether there will be housing units nearby to rehouse incumbent tenants. We understand that the tenants would like to have in situ rehousing. Of course, sometimes it is not possible to have 100% in situ rehousing. So we have to be very careful with redevelopment in terms of timetable and all sorts of aspects. As Ms. Mack said, if we casually and randomly make an announcement, some tenants, particularly the elderly ones, will be very concerned. We announced 22 estates, but that does not mean that we have already got a specific timetable for these 22 estates or their priorities. In any redevelopment project, existing PRH resources will have to be mobilized, because if we are to demolish a certain number of units, we'll have to provide other units to rehouse the incumbent tenants. So when we work out our redevelopment timetable, we have to be very careful and prudent. Ms. Mack asked, in the redevelopment process, how can we take care of the decanting demands of the tenants? We'll be very careful about that. Well, what about a subsidy? We do have a mechanism to regularly review the subsidy. Ms. Mack said that the subsidy rate has remained unchanged for decades.
I think when there is a redevelopment, please consider increasing the subsidy. Mr. Kwok, I want to make several points on the report and also the Secretary's response. First, 3F. Para 3F. The administration will make preparation for the manpower resources in the construction industry. Now, we have received comments that there is shortage of manpower in the market, and we ask for speeding up of training of local workers. We have not seen any specific measures to enhance the training of local workers. I hope there can be a plan as early as possible. As for the ratio of public housing versus private housing, 60% versus 40%, that is supported by the public, according to the administration. But we noticed that that is at least 60%. That is, many people agree that it can be more than 60%. The FTU has been asking for a 70-30 ratio. Now, we think there can be flexibility, but the general direction should be confirmed. We have been receiving a lot of calls. The average waiting time for PRH is 3 years. It will be 1 or 2 years for those who are waiting for units in the remote area, but for those who are waiting in the urban areas, they have been waiting for 5 or 6 years in order to get a unit in the urban area. I hope the Secretary will find ways to increase the support of PRH units in the urban area. They belong to those on the waiting list belong to the working class. They want to stay in the urban area because that will be closer to their work. And in fact, they can't live far away from their place of work. Now, the Secretary is responsible for transport as well, and you know that transportation costs are high in Hong Kong. Well, I don't mind spending longer hours on commuting to work, but the poor may not be able to afford the cost of traveling to and from work. And if there can be a travel subsidy, then the public housing in the new territories will be more popular. As for redevelopment of housing estates in the urban area, some reports have been published, but there is no firm timetable. The policy is a 10-year policy. You are competing with time. Can people really get a house in PRH or get redevelopment within 10 years? And that's the question. The redevelopment of urban PRH estates, can that be done earlier, so that those on the who are on the waiting list can be housed earlier? The Policy Secretary, in the consultation report, we propose a ratio of 60-40, at least 60-40. That's public opinion. And we know that some ask for 70-30 and some ask for less than 60-40. But on the whole, the mainstream is at least 60% PRH, or 60% public housing or public sector housing. We really want to increase the supply of PRH in the urban area, but land is very limited in the urban area. And we also need to get the local support. And sometimes reaction is rather strong in the local community. I know that traveling cost is high, and I am also responsible for the transport part, and I really hope that there can be, say, a monthly pass in order to keep traveling costs at lower level. As for redevelopment, the issue is whether there are vacant PRH units nearby for relocation. We are constrained by that. Why we are willing to consider Wah Fu? Because nearby there may be sites available for building new PRH units, and they provide relocation resources. As for redevelopment, it is not about a few years. If the situation is complicated, it may take more than 10 years. We need to do good planning. Otherwise, those tenants affected will have a lot of worries and concerns. Mr. KK Fong, I don't agree to the target of 470,000 units. I think it should be 550,000. 25,000 private units and 35,000 PRH plus HOS. I think now we should provide more PRH, say 70 to 30 PRH HOS, but with a shorter queue, then the ratio of HOS can be increased. As for the private sector, 20,000 units per year. When Carrie Lam was the Director of Development or Secretary for Development, there was such a proposal, but not enough land has been sold for providing 20,000 units. If the land for private development is not taken up by the private sector, then the site should be converted into PRH or HOS. People need housing. As for redevelopment of old PRH estates, you say it is very difficult. If it is in situ redevelopment, then you should arrange the 22 housing estates into different districts. In Sam Shui Po, Kowloon City, and Kwun Tong. In Sam Shui Po, 16,000 units. Nam San Estate, there is a site nearby. In Shek Kee Mei Estate, there are two sites. 2018 will be the completion date. You can announce the redevelopment of Shek Kee Mei after 4 years. During the resettlement housing era, there was a rolling plan of 5 years. You can announce a redevelopment schedule made. There are 14,000 units. I can talk to you about the details. So Kowloon City and Kwun Tong. You can use Kai Tak site. In fact, it is between 2 district councils. In fact, in these 3 districts, you can embark on redevelopment. Once redevelopment is announced, when people move out, the vacant units can be dealt with quickly. You mentioned 470,000 units. After they are completed, you would have stepped down by 2018. You also need to deal with interim housing. You have to deal with that in 5 years. Now they are waiting for PRH and they're inadequately housed and they need interim housing. Redevelopment of PRH can deal with interim housing. And there are 2,000 units vacant for 2 years. It's really a waste of resources. As for those who are waiting for more than 3 years, they should be accommodated there. After 3 years, according to the G number, they can be housed and they will not be holding on to your units. And if it is not 3 years, then 3.5 years. As long as the remaining time is longer, or the remaining lifespan of the housing units are longer, then you can use them for relocation. The development panel went to Holland and they found that the country used container units as temporary housing units, and in fact they are well built and well equipped. And now in dealing with SDUs, in dealing with those who are waiting for PRH, instead of allowing the unsold land to be basking in the sun, why can't you provide interim housing on these vacant sites? Now concerning your policies of rent control, are you going to impose rent control? It seems that the government is moving from port to starboard. Now, with regard to redevelopment, usually the tenants live there until the last moment. The vacant period is not long. We will certainly consider the available units near those housing estates to be redeveloped. In fact, we have adopted a neutral approach towards rent control. I'm concerned about the adverse impacts of rent control. That's the view of the steering committee as well. But it's a matter of common concern. I'm open-minded. I will conduct analysis. I will point out the issues. I've already said so before the housing panel and also before this committee. The Permanent Secretary.
I think the suggestion that we can use all of the existing current new developments for rehousing tenants from existing estates is not practical. We've got to keep a balance to get people off the waiting list into the new estates that are coming on stream, while at the same time providing some capacity for us to move people from existing estates to allow for clearance. We can't devote all of one to one use. It has to be balanced. And for that reason, we have to have a longer-term program, because we don't have enough coming on at any one time to rehouse everybody from the waiting list and those people that have to be moved from existing public rental housing units. So it's very important to keep that in mind.
Mr. Lee Chao-yan is not present. He will have to wait when he come back. And then Mr. Leung Chi-Chang. With regard to the position of the DAB, Mr. Yip has already stated our position. I want to draw your attention to the ratio between public housing and private housing. Will the private sector be able to achieve your target. Just now, just recently, two sites, the tender for two sites failed. And the failed tender exercise has reflected that the government may not be able to achieve its housing targets, in particular with regard to the production targets of the private sector. Now you introduce the harsh measures to clamp down on the property market. The private sector is now living, private development is living in an ice age, so to speak. Although they introduce sales promotion measures and they have achieved some effects, but the private developers are facing difficulties of selling their units. In terms, if the private sector is not able to produce enough units, then you will not be able to reach your 470,000 unit target. So our concern is that you may not be able to reach your target of 470,000 units in 10 years. So in terms of the private sector, can you do something more to encourage the private developers? In terms of the tendering exercise, or the you should talk to the development bureau so that you will not set up too many hurdles for the private developers. Otherwise, you can't achieve a target. As for public housing policy, I think that is the issue of turnover. Now you have the overcrowded policy, overcrowding policy, the under-occupation policy, well-off tenant policy. You want to increase turnover so that the waiting time can be cut. I have received calls from many residents. They ask for a faster allocation. Some have been waiting for more than 4 years. Someone called me, he has been waiting for more than 4 years. He is given a unit which had a bad history. Somebody died in that unit. That allocation was regarded as one allocation. As for those, it seems that those who are waiting are given units which are not their preference, and that is regarded as one allocation or first allocation. Now, will you review your policy then? Say for adult children, you agree that they should be added to the tenancy agreement so that they don't need to go out to find another unit. They can live, the adult children can live with their parents. They don't need to go out to get another unit, and that will help to save one unit at least. I hope you will review your policy in this regard.
Besides, those who don't yet get PRH units also pose a problem. Mr. Frederick Fong said that there must be social consensus for rental control. Well, if certain landlords are unwilling to lease their flats, we offer some, say, tax incentives to encourage them to lease their flats. Bureau Director, society would like us to do better in terms of turnover. The Director of Audit as well as the Legco's PAC also recently asked us to improve our performance in that regard. In recent years, the Housing Authority has carried out certain analyses in this regard. Sometimes households have undergone changes. They might not have been able to find a suitable flat. So in future, we would like to have more analyses of statistics and enhanced transparency. As regards the private sector, we would like to closely monitor the situation. we have to take care of the needs of certain parties. We don't want society to think that we disregard the supply in the private sector. But then for a land developer in the private sector, if he has got land resources, will try to monitor how that developer makes use of his land resources. But the overall production of 470,000 units in the next 10 years does reflect social demands. However, that figure is not rigid. There are chances for adjusting that figure. We attach importance to members' views. Dr. Low Ai Kwok, Mr. Chairman, first of all, concerning your question of whether or not the subcommittee should continue, I think our name makes it very clear that this subcommittee is to work on the long-term housing strategy. Now that the consultation exercise has been completed, irrespective of whether or not we are satisfied with the conclusions of the consultation report, the relevant issues can be discussed in the panel on housing. So we don't necessarily need this subcommittee anymore. To a certain extent, the consultation report has addressed social concerns, whether or not it should be 470,000 units in 10 years or 55,000 PRH units per year, as a colleague suggested. I think most importantly, we should be able to master the exact figures in the next 5 years. It may be unrealistic to have very specific figures for the next 10 years, but for the next 5 years, we should be able to get very specific details. I think the government knows very well in the next 5 years how many PRH units and HOH units will be supplied. As for the SDUs in factory buildings, they should be eliminated. However, the government had said that it would like to revitalize factory buildings. That had led to misunderstandings in society. People thought that they could use factory buildings for residential purposes. Now, if SDUs in factory buildings observe all the requirements of the buildings department, why can't we allow them to exist at this juncture when we're so badly in need of housing units? So if SDUs in factory buildings comply with all the statutory requirements, can we adopt a more compassionate approach? Bureau Director. Well, 280,000 in the next 5 years, or the second 5-year period. In the next 3 to 4 years, we should have 70,000 odd units per year. The Development Bureau, in its planning process, would like to satisfy social demands. That is, 40% of the 470,000 units will be in the private sector. So we'll closely monitor the production in the private sector, as I told Mr. Leung Chi-Chung just now. As for the revitalization of factory buildings, members will recall that last year in the development panel, our colleagues in the Development Bureau had already explained the government's approach. When a factory building is revitalized, it has to face a lot of requirements. To the landlords or developers, financially there may not be enough incentives. So that's an objective fact. But of course, if a land developer is willing to revitalize a certain factory building, the government would be willing to consider the proposals. Mr. Chairman, for private housing, I have to mention the recent land sales. You would like to suppress the price of bread, that is, the prices of housing units. But then if the price of flour is high, that is, if the land premium is high, how can you resolve the problem? Well, if you sell land sites cheap, you may be criticized for wasting public resources. But at the same time, if the land premium is too high, the prices of housing units will also be high. Would you like to respond, Secretary? Well, the Secretary for Development has commented on this. In fact, when the Lands Department assesses land prices, it can only give regard to objective data. It cannot subjectively forecast future prices. So this is something unavoidable. Next, Mr. Leung Yiu-chung. Thank you, Chairman. LTHS is about objectives. But whatever objectives you set, the actual question is whether or not you can attain those objectives. And in that process, a lot of problems like rental control, SDUs, redevelopment have to be resolved. So if we are to go back to the panel on housing, each of these issues will cost us a great deal of time. So I'm worried that if this subcommittee is to be suspended, we won't have enough time in the panel on housing. So I'd like this subcommittee to continue to have certain discussions. Now, the objective now is 470,000 units for the next decade. Well, of course, that is only a minimum. Well, I also support Mr. Frederick Fung's proposal of 55,000 units per year. But the most important question is how you can ensure that in the next 10 years you'll be able to provide 470,000 units. Well, yesterday, in the Kwai Tsing District Council, we vetoed 3 land sites which were to provide 1,000 odd housing units. I believe such cases will continue to emerge because for these infill sites, infill housing, you have been disregarding ancillary facilities like traffic and transport facilities. So Frederick Fung is not a question of 55,000 or what not. The most important question is how you are going to materialize these targets and objectives. Mr. Chairman, I think Mr. Leung has described the challenges facing us in future. Now, for new PRH projects, we have to consult the local communities. So we have to go to the district councils. I understand that local residents are very concerned about ancillary facilities like transport facilities. Now, if we have identified a suitable land site in terms of, say, environment, that will only be a subjective view on the part of the government. When we actually consult the local communities, we may encounter obstacles, and there are so many possibilities that may lead to changes. Anyway, there are certain planning requirements that have to be met. At the end of the day, we don't just have to satisfy planning requirements. We have to spend more time in coordinating local communities. Well, Bureau Director, you have to go to the practicalities. Well, you can say whatever figures you want, 470,000, 55,000 or whatnot. But the most important question is how you're going to attain those objectives. Yesterday, an overwhelming majority opposed the proposed 3 sites. That is an indication that the land sites identified by you are not suitable. Well, unless you are going to adopt a high-handed approach, unless you are going to tell us that whatever objection you encounter, you are going to go it alone, you won't be able to attain your objective of 470,000 units. So it's meaningless to mention 470,000 units. So under the LTHS, you have to be confident in your pledges. So how much confidence do you have? Bureau Director? Well, the LTHS Steering Committee had assessed the demands in society in the next decade, say in the increased number of households and so forth. Well, yes, Mr. Leung, you're correct. Are we confident in producing 470,000 units in the next 10 years? In the past, in the HA meetings, I also said that it depends on whether or not we have sufficient land sites. It also depends on the reaction of local communities. All these are subject to changes. And of course, whether or not the construction industry can cope, that's another issue. And then there is this financial aspect. So we'll try our very best. But if there is strong opposition at the local level, at the district level, the government cannot disregard those opposition. Anyway, we'll try as hard as we can. Mr. Lee Chia-yan has returned. Then we'll have Mr. Albert Chan. Mr. Lee Chia-yan, well, Mr. Chairman, is actually quite saddening for Hong Kong people. Well, Hong Kong people are said to be generally in support of an average waiting time of 3 years. I think Hong Kong people are forced to give that response. It's quite miserable to have to wait for 3 years. Of course, you have managed expectations well. The respondents somehow felt that it could not be better than 3 years, so they said they accept 3 years. Well, you're going to continue to produce 470,000 units. You're going to continue to identify land sites. So, in fact, you're doing nothing. It's status quo. And under 3C, I really don't know what you are saying there. In 3C, you say high priority should be accorded to addressing the housing needs of inadequately housed households. We all sympathize with the SDU tenants, but what can we do? The most practical approach is rental control. The Labour Party mentioned this many times. I don't want you to switch on your tape recorder again and tell us that you're worried that supply would be affected and you're going to conduct studies. I don't know when your studies are to end. So you're back to square one. There's nothing you can do. Of course, you tell us that you are already doing something. You're trying to identify land sites. But for 3C, to address the housing needs of inadequately housed households and for young persons, what can you do for them? You refuse to impose rental control. I think you should boost public confidence.
Well, the Secretary, we are not marking time. We have affirmed that increasing public housing is a thorough solution to the problem. The decision of a 60-40% ratio is a big step forward. We have also decided to increase HOS supply. That's also the view we heard during consultation. The increase in public sector housing depends on whether we get land and also the procedures we have to go through. I've already mentioned that. As for those who are inadequately housed, including those living in SDUs, the government's view is that it's really a problem and we have to face up to that. But the solution is not just as simple as imposing rent control. And in fact, in the community, rent control is a very controversial issue, and there are problems attached to implementing rent control. With regard to SDU, we will follow the matter up, and we hope that by the end of this year, when we publish our LTHS, we will further respond to that. Chairman. Well, it seems that his answer is really empty. You say that he say he's not marking time, but there is no new measure. No, 470,000 units. That's all along been said by them. At the end of the day, there is no solution to solve the problem. We ask whether the URA will say allow a window before redevelopment so that those vacant units can be used to house those who are inadequately housed. There is no such transition arrangement. Can the Secretary give us a specific measure which can provide an imminent solution to those who are inadequately housed? The Secretary. There are certain problems which cannot be solved. Say, for example, whether there can be interim housing. The question is you have to find these interim housing units. You have to find these interim buildings. Say for public PRH that are to be redeveloped. People move out. The tenants move out at a very late stage. The window is very short. Now, if you want to get sites for temporary housing in the urban area, now we have difficulties in getting sites for building permanent housing. How can we have land for temporary housing in the urban area? We cannot just simply plug an answer from thin air. We face a lot of constraints. At the end of the day, we need to increase the supply of PRH in particular to solve the problem. And during the interim, how can we deal with high rent and other issues? If the member favors rent control, he really wants to have it as soon as possible. But we need to recognize the adverse impacts of rent control, and we cannot ignore that. Ms. Albert Chan. Thank you, Chairman. With regard to the LTHS paper, this is the weakest in the past 3 decades. It's really disappointing. The 10-year housing construction project was a regular item in the past, but during the 7 years of Donald Tsang, Hong Kong faced a housing disaster. And after this disaster, the government is going to remedy the situation. If you want to remedy the situation, you should have a paper or a proposal to deal with that. And you have shown your sincerity in trying to remedy the situation and recognize that 470,000 units in the coming 10 years is basic. And please work hard to do more. But I think the current development direction is not appropriate. C.Y. Leung has made a number of suggestions, but in fact he is wrong. In the past 30 years, the development of new towns providing housing has proven to be successful. This is a successful approach, and yet you have changed it and you have caused grievances. The several hundred units near Baptist University has caused a lot of trouble. You really need to build new towns to provide more housing. You have anti-northeast. If it is a new town, please don't build a garden for those from the mainland. Say for the development in Yuen Long, Hong Shui Kiu. This is another development. You still need the third and the fourth new town. A new town will only provide 100,000 units. As for Tin Shui Wai, it's just about 90,000 odd units. If you want 400 or more than 400,000 units, you really need to build 5 new towns. Please work hard on building the new towns. Can you produce 470,000 units? You need the support of different sectors. I think we need to keep this subcommittee. Maybe we can have one meeting every quarter to watch the development. The administration should produce the numbers in the coming 5 years. Say how many units in which area in Hong Kong. We need to watch your targets. As for PRH redevelopment, you have to proceed very carefully. In the 80s and 90s, we've been doing that. It was very complicated. It might be a lose-lose situation. Those who are affected feel that it's a disaster. There will be an overall reduction in public housing supply. The community stand to lose. So a win-win scenario may become a lose-lose scenario. The rapid rise in construction costs is my concern. And if you speed up redevelopment, you just increasing costs. You just adding fuel to fire. I do not support public housing redevelopment in the coming 8 to 10 years. You need to fill the shortage gap first. You need to develop new towns first. You can start studying, but don't embark on redevelopment in the coming 8 years or 10 years. Wait for the reduction in construction costs. Wait for the development of new towns. C.Y. Leung and Paul Chen don't understand these problems. We have been working in the community for more than 20 and 30 years. We have encountered a lot of problems in redevelopment of public housing estates. We fully understand the problems. You need to provide us the overall housing supply in the coming 3 to 5 years, and we should continue to follow the matter up, and we should keep this subcommittee. The Policy Secretary, I fully agree with Mr. Albert Chan on dealing with redevelopment very carefully. In answering Ms. Meg and other members have already said that. As for producing units in large numbers, we need to rely on new towns. That's also mentioned in the LTHS report. Apart from Hong Shui Kiu, what do you have next? NT Northeast and Hong Shui Kiu will only produce about 100,000 units. You need 3 more new towns, Mr. Chang. Will you seek more land for 3 new towns? This is a cross-bureau effort. We try to develop NDAs. In the coming 5 to 10 years, we need to find as many land as possible. Now, can you do it by building more new towns? The Secretary for Housing should give direction to the planning department, say, to find 3 more new towns. Without new towns, you really can't solve the housing problem. Next, Mr. Leung Kwok Hong. Chairman, that's a systemic problem. The Secretary for Development, Paul Chen, is not the expert in this area. He was supposed to be a deputy secretary. But Mr. Mack encountered his fate. Now, Mr. Leung, please focus on LTHS. Mr. Albert Chen mentioned that there is no strategy. We are speaking on the report. Please speak to the question. somebody who doesn't know the issue is in the ham. Now, his accounting qualification in Hong Kong has been cancelled by the European Union. Well, in fact, Professor Cheung can do nothing without land. If there is no land, how can there be housing? I want to ask you then, without land, how can you build the housing units? The second question is this an exaggeration. John Zhang said that the housing authority will continue to incur losses if it continues to build more housing units. I therefore want to ask you, can you confirm this? Concerning the statement made by Mr. John Zhang, what is your view? After 3 years, you will go. You may be the CE, I don't know. The whole government seems to have caught by an epidemic or chicken flu. There is not enough land, though you say you want to produce more units, but you have a problem. You try to scramble for sites, any small sites are welcome. And you have rejected the proposal to deal with the problem arising from SDUs. So what are you going to do? Have you finished? John Zhang says that there is no money. Has he talked to you? Or have you told John Zhang that you don't have money for public housing? Mr. Leung, have you finished your question? Yes, Mr. Cheung, Professor Cheung. Mr. Leung asked that if there is no land, how can houses be built? If there is no land, no house can be built. And we need land, and we need land that have gone through the procedures.
Finance is, of course, a problem. In the next few years, the HA will still have a surplus. But if we're talking about such large-scale housing programs as the public sector, that is, the PRH units are to take up the biggest portion, the HA will have a very heavy financial burden. We've already informed the financial secretary of this. We'll let the Bureau Director finish first. Well, in fact, for the infrastructure, there was a growth of 190% in the past 10 years. Well, John Zhang told us that we'll have to spend a lot on infrastructure, so a fund should be set up for infrastructure. Of course, part of that fund will be for other purposes as well. So you're going to get a pool of funds. Have you finished with your questions? So where comes your money? If you're to build more HOS flats and more PRH flats, where will you get your money? Are you going to ask the land developers to make donations to you? Have you finished? Don't interrupt. Let the Bureau Director answer your questions. The HA has informed the administration as well as the Financial Secretary its financial needs. Of course, in future, the HA will have to work out the specifics with the administration in terms of financing, whether or not increased injection will be required from the government, etc. Well, the Financial Secretary mentioned the setting up of a fund, but of course I cannot answer the honourable member's question on behalf of the FS. So much for the first round. Over 10 members have spoken. Now it's my turn. I'll use my 5 minutes now. Concerning the consultation document for LTHS, here are my views. First of all, this this term of the SARG was willing to conduct this consultation study on LTHS. I think that's worthy of our commendation. In the LegCo, for many, many years, we had been asking the administration to study an LTHS, but so many terms of the SARG were unwilling to do so, and this term of the SARG was willing to conduct such a study and was willing to spend a great deal of time on consulting the public. 800 submissions were received, and now we have this consultation report. Once again, I'd like to say that I welcome this report. Now the government has affirmed its support for this supply-led strategy. I, of course, welcome this. Now, in the conclusion of the report, the government has not fully accepted the proposals of the FTU, but most FTU proposals have already been accepted. I also welcome this. Now, let me ask some questions about this consultation report. I'd like the government to follow up on these questions and respond. First of all, about the queue of youngsters is very long. The number of young applicants has made up more than 50% of the total queue. This indicates that the housing ladder is very problematic. In the past decade or so, this so-called waiting ladder had experienced a fault, such that youngsters became very frustrated and disappointed in terms of home ownership. That's why they turned to public housing. So please review the PTS and also the loan scheme for first-time home buyers, as well as well-off tenants policy and under-occupation policy. Now, you should review all these policies. As a result, you may be able to assist young persons in their homeownership problems. Then they don't need to suffer from high rentals and have to apply for PRH at a very young age. It's worthwhile for the government to look into these issues in depth. Moreover, for those who are already eligible for PRH, because the government does not have enough housing units for them, the average waiting time now stands at 3 years. Can the government reconsider offering these eligible applicants rental assistance or tax concessions? Well, the FTU has submitted proposals in these respects, but the government has not accepted our proposals. Thirdly, we hope that the government can adopt new thinking in mobilizing the resources of the housing society and the URA. We would like the government to actively consider the housing societies, cooperative housing societies of civil servants who are very willing to cooperate with the government. Finally, I'd like the government to consider certain former housing projects in Tai Hang Tung. Many of the building blocks are aging. Sooner or later, there'll be problems with them. So, can I have some brief responses, Bureau Director? To reestablish the housing ladder is also the objective of the government. To enhance turnover, it takes time. By reviving the HOS and enhancing turnover, the government has already been working very hard. As for rental assistance, the government does have reservations. This has already been explained in the report. I won't repeat the explanations. Chairman, those proposals submitted by you will be addressed by the government. Well, you mentioned Tai Hang Tung, but I think it should be Tai Hang West. It's not a government estate, so after all, the right rests with the company concerned. There were some discussions, but time has not matured yet for me to say too much about that. So we hope that the government will consider in detail views expressed by members. So all members present have spoken for the first round. Mr. Paul Tse has just entered the room. Will you say anything? No? All right, second round. Mr. Ip Kok Him. Any more for the second round? If not, Mr. Ip, it's your turn. 4 minutes. Will that be all right? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up on my previous question. I don't think the Bureau Director has actually addressed the crux of my question. The government must adopt new thinking. I hope that you can adjust the relation between PRH and HOS so as to address the home ownership problems facing the low-income households. And then there is this turnover problem. Where there are redevelopment opportunities, where there is a chance for building new PRH estates in local communities, understand that you have encountered resistance in district councils. It's not that district councils don't want to support you, but you must take into account the residents' concerns. The residents living in private flats will be concerned about the price of their properties if there are public housing around. You just said that 200,000 out of 280,000 will be PRH units, and then 80,000 will be HOS. Can you consider a ratio of 50-50? I think that will help with turnover. Then PRH tenants will have more chances to purchase HOS flats. As a district councillor, I can tell you many PRH tenants can afford HOS flats, but it really depends on the attractiveness of the HOS flats that you are offering. Well, many PRH tenants will tell you that they find it very good to live in a PRH unit. Say if they have a repair problem, they can just call the staff of the housing department and then they'll get the service. But if you are living in a private flat, you have to be responsible for your own repair and maintenance. So you have to understand why so many people want to stay in PRH units. So by building more HOS flats, you can provide more chances for PRH tenants to purchase HOS flats. So can you actually consider a ratio of 50-50? And then residents of the private sector will not feel the pressure of a possible drop in their property prices, then it makes it easier for local communities to support your policies and proposals. Very often, old estates can only attract those with a lower financial capability because these people cannot afford very expensive housing or transport. Bureau Director. Mr. Chairman, I can confirm that we do adopt new thinking. Where the conditions are appropriate, PRH tenants can opt for HOS flats. We'll definitely consider that approach. As for the new 280,000 units, if we are to have a 50-50 ratio, then we'll only get 14,000 PRH units per year. That is very much lower than the 20,000 promised by the CE for 2018. And then for HOS flats, we have green form applicants and white form applicants. There's no fixed ratio between the two. We want to attract the affordable PRH tenants in order to boost turnover. But then there are those who are ineligible for PRH. At the same time, they cannot afford private housing. So HOS may be an outlet. So we have to balance a number of factors. In any way, I agree that in future, when we consider a new HOS project, we can reconsider the honourable member's views. Well, you have to consider the ancillary facilities. You have to boost turnover by increasing the number of HOS production. Well, of the 470,000 units in the next 10 years, you're talking about 280,000 in the next 5 years. I'm not satisfied with the ratio of 80,000 to 200,000 between HOS and PRH. Bureau Director, well, as far as I understand, Mr. Ip wants more HOS flats. All right, we've completed the second round.
Wheeler.
As for this subcommittee, we were formed in December 2012. So far, we have been working for 15 months. We had 11 meetings altogether. We've straddled 3 years. Now, the administration has completed its long-term housing strategy consultation report, and the report has been submitted to the administration. The administration is now studying this report, and it's expected that by the end of this year, the administration will make a policy decision on its long-term housing strategy. I have heard 2 members asking for the continuation of this subcommittee. But I am of the view that the outstanding issues can be followed up by the housing panel. These issues can be followed up by the housing panels. And we can put these issues into the agenda of the housing panel for follow-up. I am of the view that this subcommittee has achieved the purpose and objectives set up when it was set up. I would like to ask the secretary or the clerk of this committee to report to the housing panel, and then the work of this subcommittee will be concluded. And then the housing panel will follow the outstanding issues up. That's my conclusion. And I would like to thank the Policy Secretary, the Permanent Secretary, and other government officials for attending our meetings. And there have been 11 meetings altogether. Mr. Leung Kok Hong doesn't agree with you. We are still not able to complete our work. We have so many meetings. We speak and they listen. And we have to consider how much they have accepted and how much they have done and how much they have responded. I think we should at least spend half a year to take stock of what we have done and what they have done. And I think we should assess the report and we should assess their policy. It seems that we just suddenly enter into an anticlimax. I don't think that's appropriate. Yes, I agree that we can follow the issues up at the housing panel. But we are specifically tasked to deal with long-term housing strategy. I hope that the subcommittee can be extended for another 6 months. I think half a year is enough. By then, they will have their policy ready. Thank you for your view. As the chairman of this subcommittee, I have listened to members in the past 2 rounds, and I have already made my decision. Although you have given your view after my decision, I don't think I need to change the position. Let's talk with reason. Yes, we are reasonable people. I think the majority of the members of the subcommittee agree with my conclusion. We will not leave any issue outstanding as far as housing is concerned. The housing panel will follow the matter up. With regard to rent control, well-off tenant, or under occupation policy, in fact, we have all these items on the agenda of the housing panel. Now, the Council has limited resources, and we are short of meeting sessions. When we applied to the House Committee for extension of the term of the subcommittee, I had already given the undertaking and the reason and the reasons. I thank Mr. Leung for his view, and your view will be fully reflected in the minutes. I think we have to conclude this subcommittee, and now I formally announce the end of this subcommittee. Thank you very much.